Hello, and welcome to the Tide Tracker web app, brought to you by the Wells National Estuarine Research Reserve in Wells, Maine. Now, this is the second version of this video, and it includes some improvements made in the app since the initial release. On the home page, we've added some current tide and weather statistics, such as the most recent tide level and whether the tide is rising or falling. Let's get started by looking at the top menu bar so we have the big picture. We've got the home page, where we are now, and you can always come back here by clicking the home menu or the Tide Tracker name up here. Next is the graph page. This is where we look at tide and wind data for a date range, which can be historical or future predictions. After that, we have the map page, where we can set a location whose elevation we are interested in comparing with tide levels. The About page has some good reading on who the app is for, the purpose of the app, the data sources we use, and some useful links for related information. Over on the right-hand side, we see this little wave icon, and this shows a pop-up with the current conditions information, the same information shown on the home page. This information should change every 15 minutes on average. Now, it's not going to refresh itself while you're looking at it. Rather, it checks for the latest update when you open it, and you have to close it and come back later if you want to requery the data source. Just click on the X or anywhere outside the pop-up to close it. Next, we have the Help button, which drops down a menu with two choices. The first choice is the glossary, which gives definitions and explanations of key terms and concepts, along with plentiful links to the sources of the information. All the links to external sites are opened in a new window or tab, so you don't ever have to worry about the Tide Tracker closing if you click a link. Then there's the Help option, and from here you can get to this video, and also a couple of pop-up slideshow tutorials about the graph and map pages. You may not need those after you watch this, but they could still come in handy. Lastly, we have a link to the Wells Reserve website. Okay, let's get down to details, starting on the graph page. Before considering your own home or other location that you're interested in, it's important to understand this graph. Now, the graph defaults to showing 4 days, starting with the current day. So over on the left side of the graph, we see the data that's been gathered so far today, including tides and winds. Over on the right, we have future predictions, and since we don't have wind predictions, that part of the graph is blank. In fact, if our date range is entirely in the future, the bottom wind section of the graph isn't displayed at all. Of course, you can change the date range to anything from 1 to 7 days for any dates within the bounds of the underlying data set, and that's indicated below the start date control. Plus, you can quickly scroll back or ahead in time using the blue side arrows. You can set the dates back to the default, that is 4 days starting with today, at any time by clicking the Reset button. Now, to make things more interesting, let's look at the data from the record high tide of January 13th, 2024. I'm going to select January 13 for both the start and end date so we can look at just that day. Then click Refresh. And now we're seeing just the day of that record-breaking tide. Let's look at the legend on the right and go through the items top to bottom. Now, all these terms you see here are described in detail on the glossary page, which you access via the Help section. First, the red line shows the record tide, and that's just a straight line across the graph. And that's there so you can have something to compare the other numbers to. That value is 13.44 feet. The orange line shows the highest annual predicted tide, which is the highest astronomical tide for the year. In this case, for 2024, that was 11.26 feet. Now we call it the astronomical prediction because it doesn't take weather into account. It's based solely on the gravitational forces of the Earth, Sun, and Moon. You'll notice that mean high water is next, but it's grayed out. You can toggle on and off any of these plots by clicking on the legend entry. For example, I'll click on that highest annual prediction, and now it's gone from the graph and grayed out here. And now it's back. Finally, we come to the values that can vary every 15 minutes. The green line is observed tide, as recorded by the tide gauge at the Wells Harbor dock. Here you can see where the observed tide meets the record tide line, showing that this was when that peak level was reached. The blue predicted tide is that astronomical prediction I mentioned. If you've ever seen one of those wall calendars that show the tides for wells, this sine wave should match that. The recorded storm surge is just the difference between observed tide and predicted tide, so you have a visual representation of how far apart those two values were. Now, since we're looking at historical data, we also show you average wind speed and highest recorded wind speed measured at the weather station at Laudham Farm. Wind direction is also noted. Samples are taken every 5 seconds, then averaged over a 15-minute period. So we have all this data for every 15 minutes, and as we move the mouse cursor over the graph, we see a little tooltip that shows the key data for the time that the mouse is hovering over. As I move the mouse around, notice that when we get to the high or low tide, the word high or low appears next to the predicted value. Now I'm going to jump back to today, and there are two quick ways to do that. One is to click the Today button right up here on the Start Date drop-down, then refresh. The other way is to click Reset, which, as I said earlier, resets back to the default date range, 4 days starting with today. You'll notice that at a certain point, probably at about 30 to 60 minutes ago, the wind data, observed tide, and recorded storm surge all disappear. Now that's the end of the recorded data. But to the right, which represents the future, we now have two new dashed lines. The purple projected storm surge is data published by NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that is generated using computer models. Now they claim it is experimental, and it's an indication of how much higher or lower the actual tide might be as compared to the astronomical prediction. They provide about 4 days' worth of future data, and those numbers are updated every 6 hours. The pink dashed line is projected storm tide, and it's just the sum of the projected tide and the projected storm surge. Before I forget, there are a couple more advanced graph tools you can use. In this graph, there are two modes, zoom mode and pan mode, and you can change modes with these two buttons. When the graph is originally displayed for a time range, you start out in zoom mode. When in zoom mode, you can click and hold, then drag and release to define your area, and you're now zoomed in. Once you're zoomed in, it might be useful to switch to pan mode. Then click and drag on the map to pan. Then if you want to zoom some more, you'll need to click the zoom button to return to zoom mode. To return the graph to the original appearance, just double-click anywhere in the graph or click the Reset Axes button up here. And finally, you can click this little button here to download the graph as a PNG file to your computer. Okay, at this point we have those basics covered, so it's time to address the question, what about my house or other point of interest? In this app, we're calling that a custom elevation, and I'm going to set one up now. You'll notice there's a box up at the top right of the page with the label Custom Elevation, and there's no value there. If you click the Set button, it will take you to the Map page. Or you can just click the Map menu button. The purpose of the map is so you can find your house or any other location you're interested in, and when you click on the map, a red marker will appear and the app will automatically look up the elevation of that location relative to MLLW. Well, that's a concept we'll get to shortly. So if I click here, now I've got the red pin marked Custom, and the location's elevation is filled in for me. Let's go over a couple of tips to help you find your spot. First, you can zoom in or out with the plus and minus buttons, or use a scroll wheel or your fingers if you have a touchpad. Next, you can switch the map style to satellite view if you prefer that, which I usually do. Click and drag on the map to pan it around. And finally, you can always use the address lookup. I'm going to enter the address of the fire department here in Wells. And it shows me that its elevation is over 74 feet. Once you clicked on one spot, you can click and drag it, or simply click again somewhere else to change it. You'll notice that every time you do, the latitude, longitude, and elevation values are automatically updated in the top section. Now for this video, I'm going to click on a fairly low spot on the Barrier Beach Trail over in the Wells Reserve, where there has been some flooding in the past. And it says the elevation of that spot is 12.9 feet, MLLW. Here's something you should be aware of when selecting a location. The resolution of the elevation data is 1 square meter on land and up to 10 square meters in intertidal areas. And since the map only lets us zoom in so far, if you know that the area you're interested in is not particularly level, it might be a good idea to sample several points, checking the elevation as you go so you can discard outliers and choose the spot with a reasonable sounding value. When you are satisfied with the location, if it is less than 25 feet, you can add it to the graph as a custom elevation. If it's over 25 feet, the app won't let you add it to the graph, since that wouldn't be useful and would skew the graph scale. Now after we've added it to the graph, you can always return to the map page later and click the Remove Marker button to clear the custom elevation. That will remove the red pin and remove that plot line from the graph. So we've selected a spot which is 12.9 feet, and we'll click Add to Graph. Notice it automatically took us back to the graph, and you can see that the custom elevation is displayed at the top now. You'll also notice there's a new light green plot line on the graph called Custom Elevation. Now you can see how close the tide has been to that elevation in the past and could be in the future. Now let's have a quick word about MLLW. Over on the y-axis title, you see that we're showing the tide feet MLLW. This means that all tide levels are shown relative to the MLLW vertical datum. What does that mean? MLLW stands for mean lower low water. It's what they call a datum, or a point of reference. They took the average of all the daily lowest tides observed between 1983 and 2001 and called that point mean, or average, lower, the lower of the two daily tides, low water. So if we say the tide is 13 feet MLLW, that means it is 13 feet above that level. But why is this so important? Well, for U.S. coastal areas, MLLW is the standard datum used by NOAA. However, there are other vertical datums used by scientists, and one of the most common is called NAVD88, or the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. Now that's used more for land elevations than water level. NAVD88 is roughly 5 feet higher than MLLW. Maybe you know the elevation of your house. If so, there's a reasonable chance that it's relative to the NAVD88 datum and not MLLW. This is relevant because the tide tracker compares land elevations to tide levels, and if the two numbers are not relative to the same vertical datum, then the comparison would be invalid. We'd be comparing apples to oranges. For example, if someone says, My house is sitting at an elevation of 7 feet. If they mean 7 feet nav D88, that would be equivalent to about 12 feet MLLW. If you use the Tide Tracker map page to find your elevation, you don't need to worry about this, as the Tide Tracker does the necessary conversion automatically after pulling the nav D88 elevation from the USGS service. But it's important to understand this if you have an elevation from another source and want to consider it while using the Tide Tracker graph. Speaking of the future, let's say there's a storm on the way and we want to take a closer look at that. When looking at the future, you might want to look at projected storm tide and how that compares to your custom elevation. If so, you can quickly glance over the graph and see how close the pink dashed line gets to the straight green line. If it intersects it or goes above, that could indicate a higher risk of flood. In this example, there's nothing of particular concern. And it's worth repeating that this projected storm surge data that we pull from NOAA is just that, a projection or prediction based on the best available data. Similar to a prediction of snowfall or wind speed, it is never 100% accurate. Therefore, it should not be considered a high confidence number. For example, in a recent analysis of 6 weeks of data, it has been off by an average of 4 inches. Now that can make a difference in where the actual storm tide reaches. But let's go back to the big one and look at January 9th through 14 of 2024. Now you can see that on January 10th, the observed tide, the green line, came very close to our custom elevation. And on January 13th, it exceeded it. Also of interest is the wind. For 24 hours before that record tide, there were fairly strong winds, all from the east and southeast. Winds can push the water higher, and that could have been a contributing factor. Well, that about wraps it up. Now, some folks have wondered if the Tide Tracker remembers any of your settings between sessions. The answer is, you bet it does. First, the date range. For any given day you use the app, the first time it displays the graph, it uses the default range, which is 4 days starting with today. But for the rest of that day, it remembers whatever range you last selected. So if I go over to the map page right now and then return to the graph, it's still showing me that record high tide back in 2024. For the map, it also remembers your custom elevation, your marker location, and your map settings, like zoom level, satellite, and map center. It remembers all these things indefinitely, so if you set your custom location today, if you come back to Tide Tracker tomorrow or next week or next month, it should all still be there. And for the record, the Tide Tracker does not use cookies. Now, if you don't know what that means, you can Google, what is a browser cookie? Okay, I hope this video has been helpful. Stay safe out there.